You think you know what it meant to be a prince or princess. The jewels, the feasts, the fairy tale towers rising above misty forests. You've seen the paintings, those porcelain faces, those magnificent gowns, those perfect candlelit halls where history's most powerful people stood like gods made flesh. Here's what nobody tells you. The smell alone would have made you pass out. Royalty in medieval and Renaissance Europe didn't live in the world you've been shown. The version Hollywood sold you, immaculate, romantic, glittering, is a fantasy built on top of a reality so raw, so strange, and so startlingly human that the truth is almost impossible to believe. The people who wore the crowns, they sweated, they rotted their teeth, they slept with strangers in the same room, they went months without bathing and called it wisdom. They commissioned furniture so obscene it was locked away from public view and catalogued under restricted archive access in European collections that still won't display it today. They fell apart behind their silk curtains in ways that would make a reality TV producer weep with joy. The real story of royal life, the actual skin and breath and desire of it, has been buried under centuries of flattering portraits and carefully edited court records. But it survived. In diaries, in confessions, in the panicked letters of young queens who had no idea what was about to happen to them on their wedding nights, in the memoirs of men who described exactly what went on in those perfumed, crowded bedchambers, in the architecture of palaces that were abandoned every few weeks, not out of luxury, but out of sheer biological necessity. We are going to pull back that tapestry, and what's underneath it is going to change the way you see every crown, every portrait, every fairy tale you were ever told. If this is the kind of history that makes you lean forward in your chair, the kind that doesn't show up in textbooks, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I put out deep dives like this every week, and I genuinely want to know where in the world you're watching from. Drop it in the comments right now. Seriously, I'm always surprised by the range of places these videos reach. And if you're watching at some ungodly hour because you couldn't sleep, that tracks perfectly for what we're about to get into. Let's go back. A long way back. Picture it. Northern France, the early 14th century. You've been born into one of the great noble houses of Europe. Your family has a castle, not a metaphor for power, an actual stone castle, with walls thick enough to muffle screaming, towers that block the winter light, and a great hall where smoke from the central fire pools under the ceiling like a slowly suffocating fog. This is your home. This is the dream. For centuries, educated Europeans had a mental picture of royalty that was almost entirely constructed by the royals themselves. It was a picture of divine elevation, of beings who existed somewhere above the mud and misery of ordinary life. The church reinforced it. Artists reinforced it. The whole system of feudal power depended on it. Kings and queens were not merely powerful, they were supposedly touched by God. Their authority was sacred. Their bodies were different from yours. For most of history, ordinary people had absolutely no way to verify otherwise. You never got close enough. You never walked through their halls. You never slept in their palaces or sat at their tables. The portrait you saw of a king, if you ever saw one at all, was painted by someone whose livelihood depended on making that king look magnificent. What you were never shown was the version that existed before the artist arrived. The pre-portrait king. The one who woke up with bad breath and a flea bite on his neck and a chamber pot that needed emptying. The deception was this: that power came with elevation, that wealth meant cleanliness, that the crowned head was somehow exempt from the indignities of the body. It wasn't. Not even close. The castle that noble families actually lived in was a product of military engineering, not domestic comfort. Walls were built thick to stop arrows and siege engines, not to retain heat. Most of the year, Stone absorbs cold the way a sponge absorbs water, and then it radiates it back at you all night long. Great halls, the enormous communal rooms where lords feasted and entertained and held court, were drafty, smoky, and loud with the constant shuffle of dozens of bodies. There were no corridors in the modern sense. To get from one room to another, you often had to pass through intervening rooms, which meant privacy, that most prized of modern commodities, was essentially non-existent for everyone, including the Lord himself. Even the most powerful monarchs in Europe rarely slept alone. Queen Victoria is widely regarded as the first European monarch who successfully insisted on any meaningful personal privacy. The first to push back against the centuries-old tradition of being attended, watched, and accompanied at all times. Before her, royals dressed in front of courtiers. They ate in front of audiences. They bathed, on the rare occasions they bathed, under supervision. At the Tudor court of Henry VIII, there existed an official position called the Groom of the Stool, a courtier whose duties included the most intimate attendance on the king during his morning routine. The role extended far beyond the literal. It was one of the most coveted positions at court, because sustained physical proximity to the monarch meant access to his unguarded hours, his private confidences, his real mood. The man who was present when the king was most vulnerable was the man the king talked to most honestly. Power lived in that proximity. Intimacy was the currency, and the currency was worth a fortune. Power lived in intimacy, and intimacy lived in filth. Because here is the thing about medieval and Renaissance castles that no painting ever captures: the smell. Henry VIII's court. That glittering center of Tudor power, home to some of the greatest art and music and political intrigue in English history, was abandoned roughly every few weeks throughout the reign. The king, his hundreds of courtiers, his servants, his animals, his enormous and relentlessly producing kitchen, would descend on a palace, fill it with life, and then leave. Not because they were restless, not because they missed another property. They left because the drainage systems of even the grandest royal residences were primitive enough that after several weeks of concentrated human habitation, the smell became genuinely unbearable. Urine pooled in corners, organic waste accumulated in underground chambers. Dogs and hunting birds, status symbols both, contributed their own biological reality to the mix. The rushes on the floors of great halls, refreshed periodically with lavender and rosemary to mask the rot beneath, eventually became a kind of slow-motion compost heap underfoot. Versailles, that masterpiece of European civilization, Louis XIV's declaration that France was the center of the world, was in some ways the worst of all. When the Sun King moved his entire court there permanently in the 1680s, he created a structure that housed more than 10,000 people within its walls and grounds. Courtiers relieved themselves in stairwells. They left waste in corridors, in gardens, against the gilded paneling of antechambers. There were servants whose entire function was waste management. There were special perfumed sponges courtiers carried simply to hold near their faces while moving through certain parts of the palace. The historian Tony Spawforth, writing about Versailles as an actual living environment, described conditions that in some ways resembled the cramped misery of European slums more than the paradise the paintings suggest. Marie Antoinette, walking through one of the palace's inner courtyards, once stepped in human excrement that had been thrown from a window above her. This was not a scandal. It was Tuesday. Now, let's talk about bathing, because this is where the myth and the reality diverge so sharply it almost defies belief. Medieval and Renaissance Europeans did not, as a general rule, believe that bathing was dangerous. That's a later misconception. Public bathhouses existed across Europe throughout the medieval period and were well attended. But for nobility, the equation was different and more complicated. Bathing required heating vast quantities of water, an enormous labor cost. It required removing layers of clothing that took significant time to put on. It exposed the body to cold air that, in drafty stone buildings, was genuinely hazardous to health. And it disrupted the schedule of a court that never stopped moving, never stopped watching, never gave you a moment that was fully your own. The result was that monarchs bathed far less frequently than the mythology suggests, but far more than the Victorian legend of universal medieval filth implies. What they did instead was something more subtle. They changed their linen, constantly. The body linen, the shirts and undershifts worn directly against skin, was the actual hygiene technology of the era. Change it twice a day, and you could maintain a reasonable semblance of cleanliness even without immersion in water. The royal laundress was therefore a position of enormous importance and enormous intimate knowledge. She knew things about royal bodies that ambassadors would have paid fortunes to learn. Some monarchs were outliers in both directions. Henry VIII bathed more frequently than most of his contemporaries. Regular immersion, for a man obsessed with his own physicality, was both possible and important. Louis XIV, by contrast, was documented by his own physicians and courtiers as deeply averse to water on the skin, preferring alcohol-based rinses and obsessive changes of linen to actual bathing. His reluctance was not unique. It reflected a widespread medical theory of the era that open pores invited disease. But the gap between the luminous skin in his portraits and his actual daily hygiene was considerable. Royal bodies were managed with scented powder, layers of perfumed cloth, and a cloud of costly fragrance that served the same function as the rosemary and the rushes. It masked rather than eliminated. The smell underneath all that pageantry was human. Stubbornly, inescapably human. The candles in those portraits? They were real, and they were everywhere. In a cold stone room with no central heating, packed with dozens of bodies and animals and the smoke of fires that never fully drew, the light was amber and beautiful, and the warmth was animal and desperate. That was the atmosphere in which these people conducted the business of their lives. That was the air that filled the lungs of queens and dukes and heirs to empires. Gorgeous, suffocating, alive. In those same rooms, behind those same tapestries, something else was happening. Something the portraits never showed, and the court records only partially concealed. Something involving desire and power, and the total absence of privacy that made royal bedchambers into some of the most politically explosive spaces in human history. Because who slept in the royal bed wasn't just a question of love. It was a question of dynasty, allegiance, and survival. And the answers were far stranger, far more desperate, and far more human than anyone has ever let on. The public face and the private face of royalty were never the same thing. Not once. Not in any century. Not in any country. Not for any monarch who ever sat on a throne and smiled at the crowd gathered below the palace balcony. The gap between those two faces, between the composed, luminous, God-touched figure who appeared in portraits and at ceremonies, and the actual breathing human being who existed behind the closed door, was not incidental. It was the entire point. The performance of perfection was the power. The moment the curtain slipped, everything was at stake. The curtain slipped constantly. It's easy, from this distance, to think of royalty as having made a kind of bargain. Surrender your privacy, gain the world. But the reality was more brutal than that. They didn't surrender privacy. Privacy was never theirs to surrender. It was simply taken. From the moment of birth. From the moment a baby was placed in a royal cradle, and courtiers pressed in from every side to examine the infant's fingers and toes and the shape of its face, looking for signs of health, signs of weakness, signs of the next generation of power. The body of a royal child was never private. It was documentation, evidence, a living argument for the continuation of a dynasty. That condition of being a body that belonged to everyone except yourself followed every prince and princess through every room of every palace for the rest of their lives. Consider what that does to a person. Not abstractly, actually consider it. You are never alone. From the moment you open your eyes in the morning, there are hands reaching toward you, servants to dress you, ladies in waiting to hand you your gloves, an attendant to pour your water, another to taste your food before it reaches your lips, not out of affection, out of political calculation. Everyone in that room has something to gain from your proximity, and something to lose if they lose your favor. You are surrounded at all times by people who need something from you. You cannot trust a single one of them completely, because the same intimacy that makes them useful makes them dangerous. The servant who helps you into your shift knows exactly what your body looks like. The lady in waiting who holds your hand while you cry knows the precise texture of your despair. In a world where information is currency, that knowledge has a price. This was the inner weather of royal life. Constant performance, constant surveillance. Underneath it, the unbearable pressure of a body that kept insisting on its own reality, no matter how many layers of silk and ceremony were piled on top of it. Here is an image that doesn't appear in any painting. Mary, Queen of Scots, in the weeks after the murder of her secretary David Rizzio, pulled from his side by conspirators who pressed daggers against her pregnant belly as a warning. She was 6 months along. She stood in her own blood-spattered chamber, already one of the most photographed and painted women in Europe, already a symbol, already a legend, already a political concept more than a person, and she could not stop shaking. A queen, a mother, a hostage. All three at once, indistinguishable from each other, in a room full of men who saw all three only as tools. That shaking never fully stopped. The particular terror of being simultaneously the most powerful person in the room and the most vulnerable. That was the secret engine running underneath the entire machine of royal life. It showed up most nakedly in the one place that was supposed to be most sheltered from politics, the bedroom itself. Royal bodies were political documents. Every inch of them, every function, every failure. A king's hands could tremble, and it was a diplomatic incident. A queen's womb was a matter of state. The question of whether a monarch could still ride a horse or lift a sword was discussed in ambassadorial dispatches with the urgency of military intelligence, because it was military intelligence. When Henry VIII's leg ulcer became infected, that notorious wound that never properly healed and may have contributed significantly to the darkness of his later reign, it wasn't just a medical problem. It was a geopolitical crisis. The leg told the whole of Europe that the king was vulnerable, aging, possibly dying. Around every vulnerable, aging, possibly dying king, power began to redistribute itself like water finding new channels. Desire was the most dangerous element of all. Not because desire was unusual or shameful. In fact, for most of European royal history, sexual appetite was more or less expected of kings, tolerated in noblewomen, and acknowledged as a fact of life by everyone who worked within the palace walls. The danger wasn't the desire itself. The danger was who the desire landed on, and what could be extracted from that landing. Royal mistresses were not a scandal. They were an institution. The French even had a word, maîtresse en titre, for the official royal mistress, a woman who held a formal position at court, received apartments in the palace, exercised political influence through her access to the king's most unguarded hours, and sometimes became the most powerful person in the kingdom, in all but name. Madame de Pompadour, mistress to Louis XV, effectively functioned as a prime minister for stretches of her tenure, directing foreign policy, appointing ministers, managing the king's moods and decisions with a precision that the official machinery of government could not match. She was brilliant, ruthless, and operating without a single formal title. Her power came entirely from what happened in one specific room, in specific hours, when the court was excluded, and the king was simply a man. Here's the part the romantic version of this history always skips. Madame de Pompadour didn't actually enjoy the sexual side of her relationship with Louis XV for very long. By her own account, and the accounts of those close to her, she found the physical demands of maintaining the king's interest exhausting and often uncomfortable. She reportedly suffered from what contemporaries described as a cold constitution, what we might now recognize as low libido, possibly compounded by the anxiety and physical toll of her position. She employed physicians, took remedies, ate foods prescribed to stimulate desire, because she understood with crystalline clarity that the moment the king lost physical interest in her, everything, the apartments, the influence, the protection, the access, evaporated. Her body wasn't her own pleasure, it was her entire career. The desire she was required to perform, night after night, in service of a power that technically had no name and no legitimacy, was one of the most calculated performances in the history of European politics. Louis XV knew it. He wasn't a fool. He knew she was performing. He chose her anyway, because her performance was more intelligent, more elegant, and more reliably skillful than anything else on offer. That's a transaction. It wore the clothes of passion. It smelled like perfume and looked like devotion. At its root, it was an exchange of services with the highest possible stakes on both sides. That was love in the palace, or the closest approximation to it that the palace usually allowed. Look at it from the other direction now. From the side of the person who had no negotiating position whatsoever. You're 15 years old, maybe 14. You've grown up in a foreign court, surrounded by women who have been preparing you for this moment since before you had the vocabulary to understand what they were preparing you for. You speak 3 languages, but not the one used in the country you're about to enter. You know how to dance, how to sit at a banquet table without touching the wrong fork, how to receive an ambassador with the right expression on your face. You know a great deal, actually. But what happens on the wedding night? What is specifically expected of your body? What it means for the political alliance between 2 countries? What will happen to the fragile peace if you fail to produce an heir within the first years of marriage? This has been explained to you in the most clinical and terrifying terms by women who were themselves married at 14, and who are now trying to describe the experience of negotiating a man's desire while also managing the terror of an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar country with a stranger's hands on your skin. This was not unusual. This was the ordinary experience of royal and noble women across centuries of European history. Catherine of Aragon was sent to England to marry the Prince of Wales when she was 16. He died 5 months later, and she spent the next 7 years in a kind of political limbo, too valuable to be sent home, too expensive to be properly maintained, slowly running out of money in a foreign country, while 2 kings argued about her future. She was a person. She was also a chess piece. The distinction mattered to her enormously, and to the men negotiating her fate, barely at all. Anne of Cleves arrived in England to marry Henry VIII, already 4 times married, already notorious, already something the entire European diplomatic community understood to be profoundly dangerous as a husband, having been selected primarily from a portrait painted by Hans Holbein. When Henry met her in person, he was reportedly appalled. He found her physically unappealing in ways the portrait had not prepared him for. He went through with the marriage, but declared almost immediately afterward that he had been unable to consummate it. Whether this was true, Whether the problem lay with her appearance, with his own physical condition, which by this point in his reign was significant, or whether he was simply building a legal case for annulment, historians still argue about. What is not in dispute is that Anne's body, her specific physical reality, her flesh and blood selfhood that no portrait had accurately captured, became the central document in a political crisis that involved the King of England, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the stability of Protestant alliances across Northern Europe. Her face was an international incident. There were moments, and the historical record contains them if you look carefully enough, where something that looked like real love broke through the architecture of transaction. Henry VIII's early letters to Anne Boleyn are genuinely ardent in a way that's almost startling. Raw, obsessive, vulnerable in ways that a king was never supposed to be in writing. He called her his darling. He wrote that he wished himself in her arms. He was a man in his 30s with the most powerful position in England, and he was writing letters that sound like a teenager who can't sleep. That was real, or real enough. But what grew from that real thing was an annulled marriage, an execution, and a generation of children who watched their parents consume each other, and then spent the rest of their lives trying to understand what love was supposed to look like. The erotic life of the court extended well beyond bedchambers and official mistresses. It ran through every corridor, every antechamber, every shared dormitory where ladies-in-waiting slept three to a room and whispered after the candles went out. Court culture produced an entire parallel economy of desire, secret liaisons documented in intercepted letters, affairs prosecuted as treason when they involved the wrong people, sexual relationships between men that were simultaneously illegal, common knowledge, and strategically ignored when the men involved were powerful enough. James I of England's attachment to his male favorites, particularly Robert Carr and later George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, was discussed openly by contemporaries, satirized in pamphlets, and negotiated around by an entire court that understood exactly what it was looking at. The king's desire was not secret. It was simply managed, the way every other volatile element at court was managed. Carefully, with attention to who benefited and who was endangered. The bedroom was never just personal. Every royal coupling was a geopolitical event, and every royal body carried the weight of that fact into every intimate encounter it ever had. The wonder is not that so many royal marriages were cold and transactional. The wonder is that any warmth survived it all. Some did, quietly, privately, in the margins of official history. Philip II of Spain, that famously grim, document-obsessed, black-clad embodiment of Counter-Reformation severity, wrote letters to his daughters that are startling in their tenderness. He asked about their dogs. He sent them little drawings. He worried about their health with a specificity that courtly correspondence rarely contained. The man who ran the Spanish Empire with iron bureaucratic precision also, apparently, loved his children with a directness he allowed himself nowhere else. That wasn't the public face. It was the other one. The one that existed only behind the closed door, in the hours when the performance briefly ran out of material and something genuine had space to breathe. Those hours were rare. They were the most fiercely protected resource in any palace, the thing every royal body was most desperate for and least able to secure. The first thing a royal child learned was not how to read. It was not how to ride, or how to speak a second language, or how to bow to the correct depth for the correct rank of visitor. The first lesson arrived before any of those, absorbed through the skin before the brain had the architecture to process it. And it was this: feelings were a liability, not a weakness, a liability. The distinction matters. A weakness is something you work on privately, something you overcome or manage. A liability is something that can be used against you. In the palace, in those marble corridors where every servant reported to someone who reported to someone else, where the walls themselves seemed to listen, feelings were information. Information, in the wrong hands, was a weapon. Royal nurseries were not the warm, chaotic, loving spaces that the word conjures. They were managed environments, staffed by nurses, rockers, and attendants who operated under strict hierarchical supervision, who were themselves watched and evaluated, and replaced if they failed in their duties. The royal infant was handled according to schedule, fed according to schedule, presented and examined according to schedule. Even in the earliest weeks of life, the child's body was not its own. It was assessed for health markers, checked for signs that the dynasty was secure in its next vessel, shown to courtiers and ambassadors as evidence of royal vitality. Touching the royal infant was a privilege granted or withheld as political currency. The mother, the queen who had just done the most physically devastating thing a human body can do, who had been attended throughout labor by a room full of witnesses, including the Secretary of State in some historical cases, because the birth of an heir required official documentation, was often separated from the child within hours of delivery. Not out of cruelty, necessarily, out of protocol. The child belonged to the dynasty. The dynasty had opinions about how it should be raised. What this produced across generations was a particular kind of person. Children raised in these conditions grew up to be the kings and queens whose decisions shaped the world for centuries. They learned to watch themselves from the outside, to see their own behavior the way a portrait painter sees it, as something to be composed, adjusted, presented. The child who cried in public was corrected. The child who showed fear before a visiting dignitary was corrected. The child who ran to a parent for comfort and found the parent surrounded by an impenetrable wall of attendance and protocol. That child learned, fast and permanently, that comfort was not coming from that direction. Where did it come from instead? From the servants, from the nurses and tutors and household staff who had no power but also, crucially, no stakes. The servant who genuinely loved the royal child, and there were many, the historical record is full of them, was the person who actually raised them, who told them stories, who held them when they were sick, who spoke to them like a person rather than an institution. Those relationships, tender, real, and absolutely socially illegitimate, became the emotional bedrock of children who would grow up to command armies. Then those servants were dismissed, sent away when the child reached a certain age, or when a new political arrangement required a new household, or simply when the court moved and the household reshuffled. The person you loved most in the world vanished. That was the other thing the palace taught you early. Everyone you love is also employed by someone else. Everyone's loyalty has a price. Everyone leaves. The darkness ran deeper still. Into that emotional vacuum, the space left by the systematic removal of genuine connection, poured everything that power does to the human psyche when it operates without constraint. The physical discipline of royal children was often severe, and it was ideologically justified by a theology that viewed the breaking of the child's natural will as spiritual preparation for leadership. You could not be soft. The child who would one day command soldiers and make decisions about the lives of thousands needed to have weakness driven out early. The people doing it genuinely believed this. They were passing on the only model of power they knew, the one that had been applied to them. James VI of Scotland, who had become James I of England and commissioned the King James Bible, who ruled for decades and shaped the political and religious landscape of the entire English-speaking world, had his education managed by George Buchanan, a scholar of genuine brilliance and terrifying severity. Buchanan beat the young king regularly. He mocked him in front of others, He conducted the boy's education with a contempt for the child's emotional experience that contemporaries noticed and later historians documented. James grew into an adult of remarkable intellectual gifts and profound personal instability. A man who formed desperate, consuming attachments to male favorites, who alternated between grandiosity and terror, who was genuinely afraid of witchcraft and violence in ways that went far beyond courtly performance. He was a traumatized person with the most powerful job in the British Isles. Nobody named it that at the time. The vocabulary didn't exist, but the shape of it is recognizable across the distance of centuries. Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor, retreated into his Prague castle and stopped governing, filling the rooms instead with art and alchemical experiments and a menagerie of exotic animals, increasingly refusing to see ambassadors or manage affairs of state. His contemporaries thought he was mad. His doctors prescribed remedies for melancholy. Modern historians see something different. A man raised in the Spanish court of Philip II, separated from his parents at an early age, subjected to a regime of religious severity and political calculation that left him with no stable sense of self, and who, given the resources of empire, chose to disappear. To build a world inside his own walls where the rules were his and the objects never betrayed him. The objects never betrayed him. That phrase is worth sitting with. It tells you something about what people do when human connection has been systematically made unsafe. Rudolf's famous art collection, one of the greatest assembled in European history, encompassing paintings, mechanical curiosities, natural specimens, and objects of erotic content that his contemporaries noted with a mixture of fascination and alarm, was also a symptom. A wound expressed in gold and canvas. He filled his castle with beautiful, controllable, non-judging things, because beautiful, controllable, non-judging things were safer than people. The erotic objects in his collection weren't decadence. They were a man trying to relate to desire without the risk of a person attached to it. He wasn't alone in this. The private collections of European royalty and high nobility contained erotic art, erotic furniture, and erotic literature in quantities that would surprise anyone raised on the sanitized version of court life. Giulio Romano's famous series of erotic engravings, explicit enough that their publication caused a scandal that reached the Vatican, circulated in the private cabinets of kings and cardinals. Catherine the Great's private apartments at Gatchina Palace reportedly contained erotic furniture of considerable anatomical specificity, documented by visitors and later by Soviet archivists. The eroticism wasn't hidden because it was shameful. It was hidden because it was private. Because in lives that had almost no private space, the erotic cabinet was one of the last rooms where a royal body could exist without being observed, evaluated, and turned into evidence. Desire found its expression in whatever corners the palace left unattended. Those corners were narrow. The supervision was nearly total. The erotic lives of monarchs were monitored, documented, and managed by the people around them, with the same thoroughness applied to their foreign policy. When a king took a new mistress, the existing factions at court immediately began calculating how to reach her, influence her, or neutralize her. When a queen was known to have formed an emotional attachment to one of her ladies, the political implications were discussed before the relationship had developed any further. Nothing that happened in a royal bedroom stayed in a royal bedroom. The most intimate moments of the most powerful people in Europe were circulating as intelligence reports in foreign capitals within weeks. This is the reality that all those fairy tales were papering over. Not just the cold and the smell and the arranged marriages, though all of those were real. Something more fundamental. The total absence of a self that wasn't also a political instrument. The fairy tale we tell about royal life is this: that the princess was beautiful and good. The prince was brave and true. The castle was warm, and the ending was happy. That story has survived for centuries because it does something essential. It takes the most visible, most powerful, most symbolically loaded figures in a society and makes them legible. It reduces the crushing complexity of inherited power to a narrative with a shape: struggle, recognition, reward. It tells ordinary people that the extraordinary lives above them follow rules, that virtue is rewarded, that love wins. But look at what the fairy tale requires you to ignore. It requires you to ignore that the princess in the tower was frequently placed there by her own family. That Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the medieval world, Queen of France and then Queen of England, mother of Richard the Lionheart, spent 15 years imprisoned by her own husband, Henry II, in a series of comfortable but inescapable castle chambers. She had been too independent, too politically active, too dangerous to his interests. So she was removed from the game and stored. 15 years in a room, for the crime of being inconvenient. The story we tell about that tends to emphasize her eventual release, her return to power, the triumph of her survival. What receives less attention is the texture of those 15 years. What it does to a person to be stripped of agency, stripped of movement, stripped of the political life that was the only form of selfhood available to her in that world. She survived, she came back, but the 15 years happened. The prince in those stories, the one on the white horse, the one who sees through the disguise and recognizes the true princess, was also real. The reality of him is considerably more complicated than the image. The training of a royal prince was the systematic manufacture of a particular kind of man, physically dominant, emotionally restricted, politically calculating, capable of violence on demand. From early childhood, boys of noble birth were moved away from female company, away from mothers and nurses and the emotional warmth of the domestic sphere, and placed into a masculine world of arms training, horsemanship, hunting, and the complex social hierarchy of the military household. They were taught to ride before they could reliably read. The first time a boy of noble birth killed an animal in the hunt was a ceremonial moment, a rite of passage, marked and celebrated, the first death administered by his own hand. What they were not taught: how to process grief, how to ask for help, how to exist in a body experiencing fear without transforming that fear immediately into aggression or performance, how to love someone without converting that love into possession. These were not oversights, they were the intended results. The man produced by this system was precisely the tool the system needed. What he was not capable of, and this is where the fairy tale begins to crack, was the kind of sustained, mutual, non-transactional intimacy that the word love implies in every version of the story we tell. The very qualities that made him functional as a ruler made him difficult as a husband, as a father, as a person in close relationship with anyone who couldn't be commanded. There is a letter, written by a lady-in-waiting to a young queen on the night before her wedding, preserved in a private European archive and quoted by historian Antonia Fraser, that describes the advice given to royal brides with a matter-of-factness that cuts like a blade. The bride should expect that her husband would exercise his rights over her body. She should remain still and compliant. She should not show distress. She should, if possible, manage to appear welcoming. When it was over, she should have a cloth ready to show evidence of her virginity to the ladies waiting outside the door, because that evidence would be examined and its findings reported to the courts of 2 countries before morning. The cloth would be shown. The findings would be reported. 2 countries were waiting. That was the wedding night. That was the beginning of the fairy tale. Mary Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, grew up watching her parents' marriage destroyed. Her mother, demoted, declared invalid, slowly erased from the official record, while a younger woman took her place. She grew up understanding that her own legitimacy was the casualty of that destruction, that the political decisions of men had reached inside her life and rearranged it, left her with a wound so deep it arguably shaped every decision of her reign. When she finally became queen, she burned Protestants, 300 of them. Whether that came from genuine theological conviction, from the accumulated pressure of a childhood spent watching people be made into instruments and then discarded, or from some compound of the two, is a question historians have circled for centuries without fully landing.
Her half-sister Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, who watched her mother go to the scaffold when she was 2 years old, and spent the rest of her life constructing a persona so impenetrable that historians still argue about who she actually was, never married. The woman who ruled England for 45 years refused, consistently and brilliantly, to enter the institution that had destroyed the women she'd watched closest. She understood what the royal bed meant. She'd seen the price of it at close range. She chose instead a different kind of performance, the Virgin Queen, the image of purity and self-sufficiency, a fiction so well constructed and so carefully maintained that it became its own truth. That is what growing up royal actually taught you. That desire is intelligence gathered about you by someone else. That the body is a political space. That the most powerful thing you can do with what you want is control who knows about it. The children born into those palaces absorbed all of this. They absorbed it the way cold absorbs into stone, slowly, invisibly, until the cold is the stone, and you can no longer tell where one ends and the other begins. Dressed in miniature versions of adult court clothes from the time they could walk, presented at state functions before they had language for what was happening, discussed as potential marriages before they reached adolescence, they became fluent in a language that had no name, a language of concealment and performance, and the precise management of what you allow other people to see. 500 years of that, passed hand to hand through bloodlines that ran like rivers across the map of Europe, pooling in every capital, feeding every crown. The same instruction, dressed in different centuries' clothing. The same small room with different wallpaper, teaching the same lesson to a new child. What you feel and what you show are two entirely different things. And your survival depends on never confusing them. We built the fairy tale on top of all of this. We, ordinary people across centuries, living in conditions of poverty and powerlessness and grinding daily uncertainty, looked up at the castle on the hill, and we built a story. The story we built was not about what was actually happening inside those walls. It was about what we needed to believe was happening. We needed the princess to be beautiful and waiting. We needed the prince to be brave and seeking. We needed the castle to be warm, not a place of cold stone and managed biology and the systematic erasure of anyone who threatened the line of succession. We needed the ending to be happy. Because of the people at the very top, the ones with all the gold and all the power and all the safety that the world could offer. If even they weren't happy, then what did that mean for the rest of us? The fairy tale was not a lie invented by the powerful to sedate the powerless. It was a lie invented by the powerless to make the powerful worth aspiring to. The most human thing imaginable. A story built from hope in the dark to make the dark more bearable. Every generation of royal children who grew up inside the actual castle also absorbed that fairy tale. They heard it from their nurses. They saw it in the paintings. They watched the way ordinary people looked at them with awe and longing. They learned to see themselves through that lens too, to perform the fairy tale from the inside, to be the prince or princess the story required, while privately living the reality the story was built to conceal.
The performance and the wound existed in the same body, in the same marble room, at the same moment. A boy of 12, dressed in miniature armor for a formal portrait, staring out with an expression of practiced composure that no 12-year-old should have. That expression is not confidence. Look at it again. It is the face of someone who has understood early and completely that whatever is happening inside must never show on the surface. It is the face of a child who has already accepted the terms, already begun the lifelong project of becoming the symbol rather than the person. That boy grew up and had children of his own. In the nursery of his palace, in those attended, never private rooms, the same transmission occurred. The same emotional logic. Feel nothing that can be used against you. Perform everything that is expected of you. Love what you can, but keep the love invisible. Passed from one generation to the next, like a mother tongue. Fluent, invisible, inescapable. We look at those portraits now. In museums, in textbooks, on the walls of palaces converted to tourist attractions. And we see history, grandeur, evidence of another world. We read the little cards that describe the subjects' titles and the dates of their reign and the political significance of their rule. We don't see the child who was there first, the one who existed before the crown settled into the permanent expression, the one who, for a brief and unrecorded moment before the training fully took hold, was simply a person, uncertain, feeling, wanting something that had no official name and no place in any portrait ever painted. Power was always inherited. The wound came with it, wrapped in the same velvet, sealed with the same wax. The fairy tale we built around all of it, that shining, durable, stubbornly beautiful story of princesses and towers and magic and the castle where everything ends well, is still running. Right now. On streaming platforms and in children's bedrooms, and in the way we discuss actual living royal families, as though the gap between the public face and the private reality has somehow, finally, closed. It hasn't closed. The curtain is still there. The performance is still running. The smell has been replaced by better plumbing, and the arranged marriages have been replaced by carefully managed public courtships. But the fundamental architecture, the body as public property, desire as political intelligence, love as performance reviewed by an audience of millions, that architecture is intact. The only thing that changed is the size of the room watching. That is the truth underneath the fairy tale. It was always there. You just had to know what you were actually looking at.